Research shows great camp experiences help kids grow, building independence, social awareness, and deeper friendships. Great programming starts with a great schedule. Camptivities build schedules around your camp's rules so every camper has that high-quality experience. Learn more at camptivities.com. Welcome to The Pudding,
the sweet proof of research to back up what you already know about summer camp. Hi, I'm Dr. Mandi Baker, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Travis Allison, he, him.
Today, we have the pleasure of talking to Dan Henhawk, he, him. Dan and I know each other from the University of Manitoba. At the university, Dan is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management. Dan is a scholar in Indigenous frameworks through and in leisure, sport, and land-based learning. Dan is Mohawk of the Six Nations of the Grand River. Dan bridges scholarship and practice to design experiences that foster belonging, reciprocity, and stewardship. These are all outcomes that matter for camper retention, family trust, and long-term partnerships with local nations. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's kick it off at the very beginning of the story. How did you become a researcher?
Oh, gosh. Just start off with a really easy question.
Absolutely.
Well, I started all my work at the University of Waterloo. I did my undergraduate education, then eventually came back and did my master's and my PhD at the University of Waterloo in recreation and leisure studies. And one of the motivating questions for my research when I started was centered around why Indigenous peoples may or may not have been participating in sports. And I think really that was the wrong question to ask. I learned later on as I moved throughout my process that really what I was asking was why were people not participating in sport in the way that I thought they should be participating in sport. And as a result, my graduate education was very much a journey of learning and unlearning and coming to know sort of the impact of colonialism on Indigenous peoples, as well as on myself and my family, and the ways that specifically sport played a role in that. And since then, after finishing my PhD and then coming to the University of Manitoba, this journey has continued in the sense that I'm now, or I have been, a little bit immersed in trying to understand what Indigenous land-based education is about, land-based learning, alongside still discovering much about my culture, as well as also still, I think, reconciling sort of the impact of colonization on both myself and my being, as well as those around me. You know, I've got a toe a little bit more in sports than I would like, but I'm moving into other directions like land-based learning and this broad question about leisure.
Yeah. Part of your growing up involved in sports and was involved in skill-based camps. And I understood that you also ran a camp for a summer.
Yes. So I think that was during my undergraduate years, and I got a job at our local recreation department at Six Nations. That in and of itself is unique because there's not a lot of Indigenous communities that have recreation departments, but Six Nations is a little bit unique in that regard. And yeah, I spent the summer as a director of a camp, our recreation department's camp for kids. And it was broken up into week-long camps. They were mostly focused on sports specifically. So we gave the children a lot of sort of, I guess, development and education around various sports and physical literacies. And then I think it was near the end of the summer that we actually had or attempted to have an outdoor education camp. But I was quite young, and we had a staff of 4 other camp counselors, and trying to manage at that point probably 40 kids was a lot. I don't know how successful we were, but yes, we did run it in our community, but it was quite an experience. It really opened my eyes.
Well, I want to loop back a little bit to your origin story, because I know you and I've had a number of parking lot conversations. As we do, as we're walking out on a Friday evening, Dan and I will stand there and debate the world's problems. And one of those things that I know that you wrestle with a lot, and I think might be helpful for listeners as we dive into more details in this podcast, is to start to try to understand very different head thinks of Indigenous knowledge systems versus, and I shouldn't say versus, but maybe in contrast a little bit with the assumed head think of a colonizer settler way of doing, seeing, knowing. So I know this is a big question, but can you give listeners a bit of a preliminary, a foundational, a beginner's taste of how to maybe think about different ways of thinking?
Sure. And I think that question really revolves around a focus on how we know the world, right? So when we think about the ways that we can see the world and interpret the world, if we're looking at it from what I would call, say, a Western or perhaps even a Western European lens, that in the history of Canada and the United States and all those places in which colonization occurred, it was very much sort of settlers looking at Indigenous peoples and looking at them with a specific lens and then understanding them through the lens of various ways of knowing, whether that was through sort of a Christian lens or a masculine lens. And then, of course, through the Enlightenment period and, scientific understandings and trying to measure things, right? So there was very much a period where to know Indigenous peoples and their knowledges was to actually literally almost measure peoples and pit it against the understandings that Western society had.
That
So,
notion of quantifying and categorizing and
yes.
and seeing and deeming or valuing people based on those criteria.
But also from a very anthropocentric lens, so like a
Yeah.
very human lens is putting us first, right? So I think from what I've learned over the last several years, from I guess if you want to call it a pan-Indigenous perspective, our understanding of the world is again very much based on this notion of being in relationship with all those beings in the world and the cosmos. And one of the major challenges that is again, you have to sort of think of the world as having beings in the world that may have a bit of a consciousness that then have their own autonomy and their own agency, their own ability to act. And then if that is true, then we are just one being within a plethora of beings in the world. And so then that notion of being in relationship informed how we saw the world, how we interacted with the world, and ultimately what guided our decision making in terms of what it meant to be a human being and then our responsibilities to the world. And it's not an anthropocentric viewpoint of the world. It's very much a viewpoint that sees us as but one being in the world. So it's challenging because so much of our knowledge systems to date, coming from a Western perspective, have focused on us as human beings as being this objective, sentient being that doesn't interact with other beings in the world. And I get it. Perhaps it's hard to say that maybe a tree doesn't have a consciousness, but maybe even if it doesn't, maybe it's still the interaction of being a human being that interacts with that or with that plant as being something that is not just an object, right? So
And I
that's
think I'm going to jump in there and Anthropocene or the what did you say, centric views, the idea that just humans are at the center and that they're the other part is it assumes a superiority, that
yes.
there is a hierarchy of beings in the world and humans are at the top of that. And when we throw that one out the window, it decenters the human, not only from the center, but as part of a complex ecosystem of interdependence, but it also kind of smashes the assumption of a hierarchy at which humans sit at the top. And so it really kind of throws problems up for that approach of the Western European or that kind of colonizer approach, which is I'm the superior, I have arrived, I'll tell you the right way to get her done. And not only is that not just people to another people or culture from one culture to another culture, but this is like the whole kit and caboodle of all things. And that can be organic, inorganic. It can be all, like it's all. And yes, arguments about sentience as being part of the superiority complex in there.
Yeah.
This Indigenous way of knowing says, well, still not that important because we are still in relationship with all things, sentient or not. Like you're still
Yeah.
focusing on the wrong bit here. Let's try to remind ourselves this notion of hierarchy is really problematic. So I don't know if I jumped in there and took the wind out of your sails. You were headed in a particular direction, but I just think it's helpful as we head into a conversation about how this works at camps for folks to understand that to engage in Indigenous knowledge systems, and I appreciate your comment about pan. We'll loop back to that one, pan-Indigenous, that we've got to think very differently than is often assumed for white, Western, industrialized, we sometimes call them the global North countries and cultures. Do you want to explain pan-Indigenous and what that means and why why we need to be conscientious of that habit.
For sure. And I think, well, yes, let me explain this notion of pan-Indigenous. Obviously, there are many cultures, there are many peoples around the world. There are many different Indigenous cultures, and it's very problematic to sort of lump them all into one culture and ways of doing things in the world when there are cultures that are centered in the place and from which they are from. So their cultures are very much based on their knowledge and their interaction and their relationship with the places in which they live. And as a result, I think there are many Indigenous ways of being in the world, but I think what centers Indigenous ways of knowing, and I think if you go farther back enough in history and you include Western Europeans and Asians and Africans, that we were all Indigenous at some point. And somewhere along the line, some cultures veered away from that notion of relationality and relationship with the world. So I think what really does bind Indigenous peoples in the current moment is their experience of colonization over the past 3, 4, 500 years, but also this notion of being a human being in relationship with all those beings in the world. I think there was a shift at some point away from that, again, through the Enlightenment period, but also the influence of religion as well. And so I use it loosely and I use it cautiously. I'd like it to be problematized. But with that said, I do think that that's one of the fundamental tenets of what makes up an Indigenous way of knowing and being, this notion of relationship.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful to remind people that Indigenous peoples around the world are diverse and unique and have unique relationships to, in Australia, they always called it land. But when we say land, we mean skies, seas, waters, peoples, communities, all beings. Like that word represents quite a lot. And I think there's a habit of romanticizing the notion of Indigenous person that can happen too, in that sense of lumping all Indigenous people together with the same belief system, and sometimes even attributing Indigenous folks with like a special kind of spirituality or a special, I think you know what I'm getting at here, which is all Indigenous people were, for example, these are prejudices, positive prejudices, or biases, but that idea of like all Indigenous people are peaceful people, or they never fought, or they never argued over the lines of territory or resources. And it's, Indigenous people are people. They've got all the same kinds of makings of humans that kind of bumble and fumble their way through life and do their best, but sometimes get it wrong. But like you said, what is helpful in trying to understand Indigenous knowledge systems and approaches to being is one of these tenets, kind of getting down to what are some similarities that are seen and represented across a lot of Indigenous folks.
I think part of that comes from language, right?
Mhm.
The English language is challenging in that it's very hard to capture an Indigenous way of knowing. One of the things that I've learned is that our languages, particularly the Mohawk language, was very verb-based. So we ascribed actions or the way that beings interacted with the world as part of describing those beings.
Mm.
So you can imagine then how your perspective on the world would shift if your language reflected sort of a verb-based understanding of the world. Beings doing things and beings sharing things and beings imparting knowledge to you versus us looking at them as, again, a very extractive anthropocentric viewpoint where we are just taking from them without, again, any acknowledgement of our relationship. So that's one piece to this where I think looking at Indigenous cultures and peoples and not quite understanding them because of the limits of what the English language presents. And there was a second part of your question. So your comment related to this notion of a romanticized Indigenous person, again, from what I sort of understand, is related to that notion of the noble savage.
Mhm.
And this notion of the noble savage, really a way of inferiorizing Indigenous peoples and in some instances infantile. I can't even pronounce the word.
Infantile. Is that the
Infantizing.
one? There you go.
Yes. But essentially creating a perspective of Indigenous peoples that was inferior to Western ways of knowing and being in the world. And with the trajectory of I guess you could say, modernity through
Mm.
both the Industrial Revolution and sort of economic systems like capitalism. The notion of Indigenous peoples fitting within that framework or that mindset of society and modernity really gave settler society a way of, again, looking at Indigenous peoples and their cultures and their ways of being as not being in the modern, as being in a lot of ways primitive, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
And then you add in sort of Christian viewpoints of Indigenous cultures and the notion that our belief systems were pagan and, again, inferior to organized religion. And then that's, that all added into this notion, or this romanticized notion, of what Indigenous peoples were. And I think, in collective memory, if that is a thing in the present moment, that notion of the sort of romanticized Indigenous person who is one with nature and exists on this plane of existence of harmony is actually almost something that settler society has used to sort of obfuscate the past, to sort of
Right.
gloss over, again, the atrocities that occurred that were actually real and overt, and the ways in which Indigenous cultures have been impacted negatively by colonization, and the ways in which settler society has been able to maintain dominance and power.
And we see these kinds of practices, habits, even the romanticizing replicated in camps in terms of Indigenous practices and artifacts. So let's talk about camp. What kind of trouble the camp got themselves into? Maybe a place to start is to talk about some of the practices like ceremony or artifacts that camps have co-opted and culturally appropriated and may not even be aware of. So let's maybe surface some of those. Do you have any examples that come to mind?
Well, I think one of the perhaps most overt examples of an appropriation and then a horrible misrepresentation is simply the act of gathering and having a fire and then dancing. I've seen at some American camps where the campers and the camp counselors literally are dressed up in ceremonial regalia,
Hmm.
and they then attempt to drum and then do their own dancing around the fire.
Yeah.
Obviously, and it's never done appropriately. It's never done with any Indigenous peoples or community members present. It's always just done through a very stereotypical way of thinking about Indigenous cultures. So that's one example. But if you wanted to really pick apart some of the maybe covert aspects in which Indigenous cultures have been appropriated and then presented through camps, I mean, you
Mm.
could look at a number of outdoor activities, outdoor skills, all things that were sort of based in Indigenous cultures that maybe settlers encountered. So, as an example, and we just talked about this a while ago, is canoeing.
Mm.
The canoe is a very specific vessel to Indigenous cultures here in North America, and it's found elsewhere in the world in different variations, but particularly here in Canada, the United States, the use of the canoe, the teaching of those skills, the engagement in that activity, I very highly doubt that that's ever placed in context related to Indigenous peoples, except for saying, oh, Indigenous peoples used to use these canoes to travel through the waters, without really giving any context as to how they were built. There's whole ceremonies related to building canoes because those trees, those beings that gave of themselves to provide the materials for those canoes had to be honored. And then you throw in the knowledge that was needed to then handle the canoes, to navigate the waters, either through the knowledges that people had of the land or the star knowledge that they had. There's just so many things that aren't probably touched upon in something as simple as what we would deem as being simple as using a canoe in the camp context. And then there's several other, activities, everything from fire making to maybe some of the games that are promoted as being Indigenous, things like maybe lacrosse, snowshoeing, all of those types of very stereotypical Indigenous activities that maybe don't get broken down in terms of where they come from, how were materials utilized or made, and then attaching it to the very, very real aspects of culture in which people utilize these things in terms of their survival maybe ceremony, etc. So yeah, those are some examples.
It keeps coming up for me, the idea from Western culture of the separateness of people from everything, and the extrapolation of that, of course, is that they've imposed the separateness of white people over beings and other people and all of that. And that psychological separateness has allowed the industry as camps to just take on things and just vacuum them up without making the connections to their history and their significance to others.
I have a weird capitalist way of helping folks think through this. And actually, my class was just reviewing the notion of through the wall, a paper Dan knows and actually recommended to me to use in a class that I'm teaching at the moment. But that idea that we have gotten used to all things coming through a wall. And so we've gotten used to the notion of there being a wall. So like plumbing and electricity, this idea that, so that's one. But here's another way of thinking about this. And it's very capitalist. It's the idea that you wouldn't rip off anybody's IP, their intellectual property, and then sell it for your own good. But then we use canoes as a central feature of a camp program. We sell that, we make profit off that. But at no point do we recognize that that intellectual property was never ours to begin with. And that profit, there's no royalties going back to the people who first figured out how to work with the resources of the land and be in relationship with land to navigate the waters and to make life as a people and in connection with ecology work. So it's a kind of a weird capitalist way of looking at it. But if we use that, we use what we know to think about a different way of knowing, it's kind of like a real serious copyright issue. And that's kind of constantly at play in a lot of different features in the way that we live.
Well, it's a really interesting discussion, particularly when you try and parse out how cultural interactions may have occurred over time. I tend to believe that when the first European settlers came to this continent, that when they interacted with peoples who were here, everything was actually quite reciprocal and respectful. But definitely, I think through time, and particularly with the burgeoning capitalist economy, and also you throw in a settler colonial society, which had lots of hubris and lots of desires for both order and, in a lot of senses, the conquering of lands for resources. You can see the arc of that modification and appropriation of culture as being part of settler colonial society and colonization around the world. Because really, colonization was about the appropriation of lands and culture as a way of maintaining the empire, right?
Yeah.
And that mindset of taking and then utilizing it for yourself, which is, again, maybe part and parcel of a capitalist understanding of the world, was from the very early beginnings of settler and indigenous relationships, part of that discussion, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I think maybe what we're getting to now, at least in some parts of the world, is an understanding of the impact of that. I don't know, I haven't been part of camps or camp culture for a bit, so I don't really know how it's operating at the moment. But, I think hopefully this whole discussion around settler colonialism and reconciliation is part of those discussions of what's happening at camps.
Do you have new leadership team members this summer and a full plate of to-do list items? Let ACA Illinois and Michael Brandwein help. Send your new and returning leadership team members to the annual and globally popular Brandwein on Superstaff Supervision, the quick course on outstanding skills to coach, motivate, and bring out the best in staff. This virtual training brings all of the creativity and toolbox-filled techniques Michael's known for, but without having to pay for travel. This May 17th, leadership team camp staff from all around the world will gather virtually to be trained on 6 essential things leadership team members must do every day to encourage, coach, and lead camp staff. Learn more and join us at acail.org/Michael Brandwein. Hurry, early bird ends April 1st. The American Camp Association's impact study shows that high-quality camp experiences build independence, social awareness, and a love for nature, and that campers leave with deeper friendships and a stronger sense of community. Those outcomes start with great programming, and great programming starts with a great schedule. Camptivities builds schedules with your camp's unique scheduling rules ensuring every camper gets a consistent, engaging experiences that fosters these proven benefits. Turn research into reality at camptivities.com. Now's the time to find a better way to schedule with summer. Don't wait, next summer will be here before you know it. Camptivities would love to show you the next big thing in camp. Visit camptivities.com to set up a time to chat, and let them help you get away from your desk and back out to camp.
And I think it might help folks to understand the notion of reconciliation. And I'm going to steer you towards how we might be able to do that in camps. But I put the notion of truth and reconciliation to my understanding. And if I've got it wrong, Dan, help me learn. But the idea that we first need to start by acknowledging how we've hurt folks, and in particular, when we talk about truth and reconciliation in Canada, we're talking about the hurts and the harms and the violence that was done to Indigenous people. And reconciliation is the notion of making right. So once we've said we're sorry, once we've been able to say, I did this awful thing, my ancestors, my way of thinking has done these awful things to Indigenous people, then we step into, and hopefully this is in the Mohawk tradition of verbs and action, we step into the space of, well, how do we make it right? And that is an incredibly hard question to answer, because there are some wrongs that you can't undo. You can't crawl back into history and withdraw the notion of residential schools. And, we can't undo that pain. But what we can do is stand in the present saying, got it, we got things wrong, I'm full of flaws, but I want to make right. What actions? Enough rhetoric, enough talk, enough lip service. What actions do we take to make things right? Having said that bit, how do camps in this moment start to engage in making it right, the reconciliation part, in the habits that camps have and the habits they could have in the future? What do you reckon? Where do we go?
That is a really good question, Mandy. And I think part of the discussion begins with exactly what you mentioned, which is the truth-telling part of reconciliation, or the whole notion of truth and reconciliation. And perhaps that's where camps have to start, is thinking about what is the truth of camps and the history of those camps, and perhaps the role in the perpetuation of settler colonial violence against Indigenous peoples, the role of camps in the appropriation of Indigenous knowledges, the misrepresentation then of Indigenous peoples and their cultures in the various activities that they engage in. And then beyond understanding those truths, the action part, or the reconciliation part of this, is then engaging in activities that I think are more representative of where we want to go as human beings. Because fundamentally, I think one of the questions that is centered for Indigenous peoples is that settler colonialism did not view us as being human beings, right? So, a lot of discussion occurs around the dehumanization of African slaves, but the discussion around the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples and their knowledges is never really discussed. And to then flip that from a settler perspective to recognize Indigenous peoples, as human beings, as having a culture worthy of knowing and engaging in, requires people to engage in that truth telling, and then re-engaging in the fundamental things that makes Indigenous cultures what it is. And I think the challenge in that is that everyone is trying to engage in Indigenous practices. And I've had this experience through the land-based education piece of my work, where people want to know, well, how do I do ceremony? Right? Do those activities that will then help me engage in some type of reconciliation. And while that's fine, and I think that's part of the process, engaging in activities or ceremonies is only half of the process of reconciliation. Because in order to engage in those activities or ceremonies in a way that honors Indigenous peoples, really comes back to understanding that notion of relationality, that relationship-based culture that informed everything that Indigenous peoples did and informed how they interacted with the world. That's fundamental. That's the one thing that I've learned over many years now, is that the fundamental aspect of Indigenous people's culture, of my culture, was based on this notion of relationship and relationality, this engagement of other beings and understanding our obligations as human beings, but treating those beings as an equal to us as human beings.
Yeah.
That then moves into the realm of language,
Yep.
that verb-based understanding, that action-based understanding of the world. And that's the hardest thing, because I don't think a lot of people understand that.
Yep.
They see the superficial, they see the cultural ceremonies, they see the canoeing or the lacrosse playing, but because they don't have the understanding of relationality, they can't quite understand though how those activities and ceremonies were born out of those notions.
Yeah.
And until we get to that point in the world of recognizing that other way of being, that Indigenous way of being and knowing in the world, we may keep continuing to spin our tires a little bit,
Yeah.
because engaging in ceremony, trying to present Indigenous cultures in a way, again, that is through a settler lens, is always going to perpetuate settler colonialism.
Yeah.
Truthfully, I think it would be also problematic, though, for camps to bring in Indigenous people, because, again, that can sometimes be a bit tokenistic. It can be sometimes a bit problematic. Indigenous peoples, not all Indigenous peoples also have an understanding of relationality either, right? We also have to recognize that this whole process of colonialism has fragmented all of us so much that it's going to take a lot of engagement with the truths of the histories of what happened to then implement an almost new way of being in the world that
Yeah.
doesn't, again, reappropriate knowledge. That I don't want to be a Luddite, but at least implementing ways of knowing or being that speaks to the human experience without maybe some of the technological advances that we've had, which is, again, that's another whole nother can of worms.
Oh, is that ever a can of worms?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about my daughter and her mobile phone usage and how it's driving me nuts, because my concern is she's not in and engaged with the world and the beings of the world in all their forms. It's one of the potential great advantages of camps, especially ones that have nature-based sites and can invite young people, like actually teach young people from a very early age about what it means to be interconnected and interdependent and not at the center, and to do it experientially. And I think when you talk about things like lacrosse and canoeing, you can do those activities without learning the lesson or the spirit of what those activities both were sort of a product of and produced, is the spirit of relationality and the spirit of being interconnected and recognizing it. And to me, having worked in a bit of outdoor education in Australia and doing camps in Canada and these kinds of different moments, I have seen some incredible people foster incredible experiences for non-Indigenous to experience what that actually can feel like. And these are really, really meaningful, even transformative experiences. But to me, and something you've also kind of mentioned, that this way of thinking and knowing isn't super aligned with the way that capitalism and society by consequence run. So you're kind of uphill the whole time. And that kind of power of persuasion is always going to be hampered by this capitalist majority experience always going on. So it takes, my fear is called resistance, and resistance can be exhausting. It's showing up every day with a different way of thinking and constantly trying to help other people at least recognize it or maybe learn a bit about it. So while participating in Indigenous activities like ceremony, I'm so grateful our university actually has a number of open learning opportunities for Indigenous, like a sweat or going to dance or learning how to dance. I really, really appreciate the opportunity for that education. But like you said, at the end of the day, the concern is, did you partake, take a picture and put it up on your Insta, and that was the end of your learning? Or did you engage in a way that helped you start to think about the spirit of the thing and a different way of knowing and relating? And so that, to me, is an important part. I hear what you're saying in terms of camps and thinking through these things. What are the ways that we can encourage camp directors, decision makers, leaders, industry leaders start to grapple? Like, how do they start this process? I'm thinking off the top of my head of a book that you and I both really like braiding sweetgrass as a really nice way to start, to start. Now, there's lots of different ones, lots of different resources, but for me, reading that book and processing it and thinking about gratefulness even, where she writes about gratefulness really early on and starts just that beginning of almost adding a ritual of gratefulness in your life so that you recognize, the IP, as I called it, that where did my canoe come from? And I'm grateful to the trees and the boat makers in history who made this possible for me.
That notion of gratefulness is front and center of what relationality. It's actually, and again, in the English language and the way that we use it in our culture is Thanksgiving.
Yes.
So at the beginning of
And not just one day a year.
Right.
Yes.
at the beginning of any ceremony, at the beginning of any discussion, any community gathering, even perhaps if a person felt like they needed to give a Thanksgiving in a particular moment, this notion of Thanksgiving was front and center. Because if you think about it, this notion of Thanksgiving is thanking those relations for their giving of themselves for this world. So, yeah, perhaps that's one way. It's specific to our culture, our Mohawk cultures, our own cultures. Other Indigenous cultures throughout Canada and the United States engage in it in a certain way as well. Maybe not specifically like the Mohawk people do, but they do engage in some type of thanks or thank you to those beings in the world. Again, highlighting that we are just but one being in amongst a number of beings. So that's what Robin Wall Kimmerer was talking about. And again, I often think about it as being there's two, well, maybe not. I don't want to dichotomize things, but there are various pathways to reconciliation, right? There's acknowledging the truth of settler colonialism and the violences that occurred. There's the recognition of Indigenous cultures and peoples in the present and what they engage in and how they contribute to things. But I also wonder too whether part of the healing process for settler colonial society is to come to this realization of their own indigeneity. Settlers were all from someplace at some time or other in the past, and then they settled various parts of the world and sort of forgot where they came from. Now, that's not a suggestion that settlers need to go back to where they came from, but it is a suggestion that if they want to be Indigenous, and I'm not talking about Indigenous in the sense of joining Mohawk culture or other Indigenous culture, but if they want a sense of indigeneity and their own sense of humanness, then they have to start thinking about their place in the places where they live and are rooted. Start, as a colleague of mine told me once, to start listening to the place in which they are rooted. And once you start listening to the place in which you're rooted and listening to all those beings in the world, then you start to give thanks for everything and all those beings in the world. And then from there comes the culture and the ceremonies and the things that recognize that thanks and that gratefulness. So it's not an easy thing for camps because they are, they operate in a sort of finite timelines and they have a very specific purpose. But maybe it is something as simple as giving, or we call it the words before all else, a Thanksgiving that starts every day, right? Or every component of a camp.
And ironically, a lot of camps do have a gathering at the beginning of every day, and there are words that are shared. It just seems to have been, disconnected from this words before all else, this giving thanks. And to me, that's to me, it's not just the being grateful and recognizing how beings have given. They've given resources, time, energy. And to me, time and energy are such precious resources beyond the sort of tangible, but have given so that I can be there. And to me, it's not just a gratefulness. It's this really sweet and gentle invitation and reminder not to hide your goodness and keep it just for yourself. By saying thanks, it also kind of reminds us of our responsibility to also give of our time and energy in relation to the beings around us. It's this really kind of almost, to me, when I was reading that chapter in particular and thinking it through in the habits of my daily living where thanks are given, it felt like this gentle reminder, like, yeah, actually, the world needs you to keep giving too. Otherwise, this whole thing doesn't work. It doesn't continue. And so I wanted to add that little bit of, it's kind of that reminder and that invitation, like, what you have to give is needed too. We want that too. That's how this interdependence giving thing works.
If I can just stand on a little bit of a soapbox too.
Please.
If you think about it, like North America has Thanksgiving and other places don't. And as we're coming up on American Thanksgiving, it's a time to reflect as to why we have Thanksgiving in this part of the world. And part of that relates back to the cultures that were appropriated and never acknowledged, right? And that notion of Thanksgiving, even that acknowledgement in a camp setting, I think would probably be very powerful to let people know that, there's a reason why we have these words or we have these ceremonies, and that a lot of it is reflective of Indigenous cultures that came before. And we can extend that to a lot of different things, food and other physical cultural activities.
I love getting you going on corn. I loved it. It was one of the best conversations I got to be on the wall for. Dan and a mate got into a conversation about corn growing and where corn originated and how it traveled through North America. And I was clearly lost in the details. It was over my head, but it was just this incredible passion for, we get to give thanks for having corn.
Well, if I can very quickly add a point about that.
Do it.
Getting back to the discussion of capitalism, part of the notion of capitalism is extracting resources for wealth. Part of that discussion is ownership. In Indigenous cultures, we didn't have that notion of ownership as being front and center, because if you live in a relational way with other beings, how can you own those other beings? So even the foods that we grew, and we call those foods our sustenance, corn, beans, and squash, amongst a few other plants, those were beings. And so we could not own those beings. We were in relationship with those beings. The sharing of that knowledge to settlers who were coming to this part of the world was about sharing the knowledge of those beings so that we could all survive and thrive. But along the way, again, that got misguided, and capitalism came forward and decided, no, we need to own all of that. We need to appropriate it, take it, extract it, use it for our own profit, and not acknowledge where it came from. And so corn is one of those plants, and the history of it is really interesting because corn didn't come into being by itself. It was propagated by Indigenous peoples who over hundreds of years worked with it, learned from it, understood it, and then essentially grew it into all the different forms of corn that we had. And as a result, it became part of our cultures and this notion of, again, non-ownership. So it was very much front and center of this notion of relationality. Again, how can you own knowledge when it's given to you? And the best way of honoring those relationships is then to share it with others. So again, it's another lesson that maybe camps could learn from. The foods that they have, particularly corn, beans, and squash, are from an Indigenous cultures that view the world through a relational lens. It's a small thing, but it's...
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and for joining and sharing. And I have so much to think about, and I'm interested in further discussion with you and with others about what truth and reconciliation looks like for summer camp as an industry. But we're really grateful for your perspective today. And just as a way of wrapping up, where should folks go to find your research, and how can they connect with you if they have follow-up questions?
Well, you can find me at the University of Manitoba website. Just go to the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management website, and there's a whole list of us as scholars, and certainly they can find my email there and they can contact me. That would be the best way.
Thanks so much for being on the pudding.
Dan, I am forever grateful for this conversation and for the ones in the parking lot. I'm giving you my thanks now and forever into the future, because I feel like I'm constantly learning just by being in relation with you and being able to have those chats, even if they are late in the parking lot.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us here. And for everybody listening out there, if you didn't know, now you know, Camp Pros.
Hey, Camp Pros. We love that our industry is built on sharing. In order to foster that spirit, if you've gotten even one good idea from a Go Camp Pro podcast, masterclass, from the Summer Camp Professionals group, a conference, or wherever else, we ask that you give credit where credit is due. That way, it'll encourage Camp Pros to keep freely sharing their ideas and make the camp industry as a whole better.